Alex Schafran was raised in Marin County and recently returned to the Bay Area after a stint in the UK as a lecturer at the School of Geography at the University of Leeds. Alex holds a BA in history from Stanford University, an MA in urban planning from Hunter College, and a PhD in city and regional planning from the University of California, Berkeley. His book, The Road to Resegregation, Northern California and the Failure of Politics, was published by the University of California Press in 2018. Copies of the book are available from the library in print and as an ebook. And this is it.
There you go.
Please welcome Alex Schafran.
Thank you, Abbot. I'm thrilled to be here, and thanks to the Marin City Library as well for playing host. It's really an honor. You know, I'm a Marin guy. This is the first ever talk I've ever been invited to give in the county where I grew up, where I went to high school. And it means so much to me to be able to do this. And and particularly in a community like Sausalito and Marin City, which is so important in the history of these issues in this region. And I know what it means to the city. I know some of the issues that both the city and Marin City, which is not a city, is part of unincorporated Marin County. Everybody remember this. These things matter. These issues are really important, and I hope that the talk tonight can contribute to the conversations that folks are having, whether it's about schooling, whether it's about waterfront development in Marinship and affordable housing. All of these things are important and they're difficult, and I'm going to talk about them today. But the purpose of me being here and of talking about this is to hopefully, offer useful and constructive ideas and inspiration to these efforts. And I hope that eventually your communities can be seen as a symbol of restorative justice, of ways of trying to recognize past wrongs, restore things that have been taken or lost, but also move forward and build new communities in new ways. And so I'm just really excited to be here. We're going to do a little bit of a kind of unusual format, in the sense is that so many of you submitted questions beforehand, which is really wonderful. And I just want to read you a handful of those questions that we got, because I've structured my comments in a way to try to address them in a certain way. And you'll apologize because I'm probably not going to get as much time for the Q&A from folks in the room, but please reach out to me. alexschafran.com is my website, and you can find a way to contact me via there. I'd be happy to try to answer questions. And especially for those of you who are involved in organizations and trying to do things, I would love to be able to provide any assistance that I can. So I grouped them into like 4 categories. So there were very few questions that were asked about history, about how we got here, or about what we mean by segregation. Abbot noticed this as well. And so that's something even though not many of you asked about it, I am going to address it because I do think it's really important. A lot of folks ask what can be done. What can individual residents Marin do to increase racial diversity in the county? What can I do as a Sausalito resident to encourage, support, and facilitate diversity in my community and end racial separation? How can Marin be desegregated? Or what are your recommendations to intervene in these kinds of ways? Some folks pointed out like difficult trade-offs, right? How do we balance between desegregation and gentrification? An old high school friend of mine I was talking to asked me about the trade-off between environmentalism, which I know a lot of folks find very important in Marin County, and which I do as well. And I'm going to address in particular seeming trade-offs between environmentalism and desegregation. And somebody also brought up, the question of Golden Gate Village, which I know I'm not an expert on, but right, about how do you respect the rights of people to return, to stay in Marin City. And then there were a lot of questions, and this is one of the hardest parts, about how do you engage with people in Marin County who don't see racism, who claim to not be racist, or nobody's racist, or just not seeing it here. Even in the face of actual racism, people asked about racial profiling in Tiburon, anti-Semitic lists at Redwood High School, all of these kinds of issues. And so I'll try to touch on these all to a certain extent. Again, my apologies, I'm not able to address everybody's question in the specifics, and hopefully I'll leave enough time in the Q&A. So where I'd like to begin is really with my own story a little, because I think it explains why I'm here. And one thing that's really important for folks to know is that I consider myself, I'm a white progressive environmentalist. If I talk in terms about white progressive environmentalism, I'm not using you, I'm talking about we. This is something that, I take responsibility throughout. And I think it's important that these communities address these issues. I also want to acknowledge that there are many non-white Marinites probably on this on this call, on this meeting, or whatever it is. And that I want to recognize like how difficult it must be to be non-white in Marin, where the assumption is that everybody in Marin is white and Marin is so associated with whiteness. And that if I am talking in some ways kind of aimed at folks in power that are white, I do it in a way because I do think that this is in some ways where a lot of the movement has to come, and that many folks of color in Marin County are already carrying a heavy burden and trying to educate folks. And it's time for white folks like me who are from the county to be able to sort of speak to our families, to our neighbors, to our elected officials, who I think are almost entirely white with the exception of maybe 2 elected council members in the county. And so again, I apologize if folks of color on this call feel in any way that I'm not speaking to them. And I hope still that the work, that what I'm gonna present here is really useful. So how did I come to write a book about segregation or resegregation in the Bay Area? And I'm sad to say in many ways, it didn't come from growing up in Marin or from things that I learned in Marin, but from my experience of leaving Marin. One of my earliest memories back in the day is going to Warriors games with my dad, where we would drive over the Richmond Center Bridge, and anybody in this room old enough remembers, used to be you had to drive through Richmond to be able to get to the main freeway complex. And that was one of those experiences. It was always leaving Marin, right? When I went away to college and I learned to start asking questions, when I started working in Oakland and Berkeley and in New York City and these kinds of places, this is where I started to learn about racism and about segregation. I went to New York City, I became a housing organizer. And that's really what I really started to understand how Americans are housed. I started to learn more about how the history of racism intersects with the history of housing. But I had to leave. Right? I didn't learn these things at Whitehill. I didn't learn these things at the high school now known as High School 1357 on what will probably no longer be Sir Francis Drake Boulevard for much longer. Right? I wasn't taught this in school. I didn't learn it growing up in San Anselmo. I had to leave. I had to become a professional in these spaces to learn a lot of that. And some of this is just about sort of the history and the way in which we talk about race, or the way we teach race, or the way we learn about race. And some of it has to do with the way we do or do not really learn about how much of anything around us is built. And this is going to be an important thing that I'm going to emphasize throughout. This is as much about learning about housing and how housing is built and how housing politics work, or transportation, or these other issues, as it is about just learning about straight racism. This is a particularly important thing that I want to know. And this is going to be my first sort of main point that I want to make to folks out there who are asking, like, what do I do and how do I engage? Is that we got to start learning about this stuff earlier. Like, I didn't learn enough in school. And I granted the curriculum has obviously changed since in the hundreds of years, it feels like, since I was at Whitehill Middle School or High School 1357. But I don't think that it's changed enough. And it's not just that it's not just the issue of learning about race or racism, is that we're still not learning about housing, right? Learning about things in Birmingham or in Selma is important, or learning about things in Oakland and San Francisco is important, but these are issues that happen in Marin, and Marin students need to learn about how this happened in our own county. And we just didn't back in my day, and I'm not confident enough that we are doing so. And so this is one of my first pleas, right, is to educators out there, to anybody who's involved. And by educator, I mean, like, if you're coordinating your book club, you are an educator, because it's like, if you're helping get the books chosen, or anybody who's like sitting in front of students in a classroom, if there's anything that I can do in Marin specific to help folks try to figure out resources to learn, I'm happy to point people to resources that I know. I'm happy to talk to people about what it would take to build resources and create resources that don't currently exist. And this is a particularly important moment in a crisis in education. One of the opportunities in some ways is that students need to get out of the classroom more often, because classrooms aren't particularly safe, and getting them into our communities and learning and seeing around them and teaching them how everything got there, I think can be a really powerful way of both confronting racism and racial inequality and racial segregation, and the need to change our education system and make teachers safe and students safe in the time of pandemic. So like I said, please do reach out if in any way if you can find me, and Abbot could always put you in contact if Google isn't doing the trick. I have a very unusual last name. If you spell it right, you'll find me. So what do we need to learn, right? This is one of the key things. So I'm going to say learning is a really important part of what we're doing. I think what is in my kind of magical curriculum. And so one of the things I think is really important, and Abbot and I talked about this a bit when we were preparing for this, is to try to learn first a little bit about what do we mean by segregation, right? And so, what am I seeing? First, try to for me, a big focus is to always try to understand the world as it is. Not, I know we're talking about the world as I want it to be, but sometimes that can really kind of cloud our vision. And so what is out there? What am I seeing? And so one of the ways I approach segregation that at times is a little different from a lot of other scholars of segregation, unfortunately, is I focus a lot on the question of how segregation has changed. Because it's not 1950, it's 2020. That's 70 years. A lot has changed during that period of time. And so what I'm guessing there's a lot of folks on the call know already are what, kind of the New Deal era, post-war era understanding and creation of segregation, right? Now, you may or may not know it had its roots earlier. A lot of our zoning laws came as part of anti-Chinese racism in the turn of the century. The racial covenants that many of you, if you live in a house that's built before before the war, you might want to check your deed. It may still say that certain people of color, maybe even Jews or Italians or Filipinos, whomever, are not allowed to live there. These predate that whole wave of suburbanization. But of course, it was the war, right? It was the war that brought out African Americans en masse from Louisiana, from Texas, from Arkansas, to work in Marin and right? And it was in that period of time where they were not allowed to live in Sausalito that Marin City became such an important center and the primary center of African American life in Marin County. And so this is the image of segregation that has formed in our mind. The only other example you'll really find of it in Marin County is the Canal district in San Rafael, right? This is an area of low-lying, flood-prone land that was built as sort of affordable apartments, primarily for white families as they were sort of working their way up the property ladder back in those days, and then became home to refugees from wars in Central America, from wars in Southeast Asia. To this day, these two communities, Marin City and the Canal, remain the only non-majority white communities in all of Marin County, right? So this is what I call old school segregation, or your grandmother's segregation. It's a traditional way of understanding segregation that still exists in a lot of communities around, again, including Sausalito Marin City, including Canal District and San Rafael, where people of color have limited opportunity to move elsewhere, and everywhere around them is largely white. There's a great book about Oakland by Robert Self called American Babylon, which I really encourage you to understand. We'll explain that post-war era in Bay Area terms, at least, in a way that is really, really useful. Again, many of you may have also read The Color of Law, right, by Richard Rothstein, which I know is making its way through book clubs. It's a fantastic book. It tells a really important history, and it does a really good job of telling it, part of it through the Bay Area as well. But this is a particularly kind of old type of segregation. But again, the key thing I want to emphasize is that 70 years later, right, these two communities still remain the only majority non-white communities in all of Marin County, and everywhere else is somewhere between like 60% white and like 90% white. Right? And so this older form of segregation still exists, but things have also changed. A lot of things have happened in those 70 years, right? And this is one of the most important things that I really want to emphasize, especially for folks who are trying to get woke through reading Richard Rothstein and learning about redlining and learning all the things that we did after the war. That stuff is really important, but there's a lot that has happened since then. And this experience isn't necessarily the majority of the experience of communities of color in the state of California, at least not right now. So let me explain a little bit about what I mean. And this is where I'm talking about resegregation, right? So between 1970 and 2010, the San Francisco Bay Area, so that's the nine counties going all the way up to Solano County and down to Santa Clara County, all the way down to Gilroy, right? Or from Santa Rosa all the way on down, right? Added about 2.5 million people. 2.5 million people. In Stanislaus County and San Joaquin County, we added about 750,000 people, almost all of whom were transplants from the Bay Area. Or they might have even stepped foot in the Bay Area, but they came for a job in the Bay Area and couldn't find a house in the Bay Area and are living out there. So we're still going to consider them as transplant because they're part of our economy. They're part of our community. During this time, again, 2.5 million people in the Bay, 40 years, right? 40 years, 2.5 million people in the Bay, 750,000 people in 2 counties in the Central Valley. Marin County added 46,371 people. The city of Antioch, between 1980 and 2000, which is one of the most important centers of African American life in the Bay Area now, added more people in those 20 years than Marin County, as the whole county did in 40 years. So this isn't like your grandma's segregation. Grandma's segregation is we're going to build Marin City in unincorporated land on the other side of the freeway and give them separate schools and separate everything. Right? Well, eventually became one school and now it became two schools, and I know the story, right? This is very different, right? What this means is that kids growing up in Marin City who want to buy a house are now like living in Sacramento or in Elk Grove or in Antioch or in Vallejo or in Vacaville or in Fairfield or in Lathrop or in Tracy, names of places which, if you are a person of color in the Bay Area, you know these communities because your family lives there. And if you are white from Marin, chances are you may not, because you've never been there, because you don't have to, your kids may not have had to make that move. Now, that's not entirely true. There are plenty of white folks who grew up in Marin who've seen their kids move far away, or they moved to Oregon or Colorado, or you name it. But this is a different kind of segregation, right? It's a different kind of map. Folks are spread over a much, much bigger plot of land. It's not, you know, one side of the tracks versus the other, but it's still a kind of segregation, right? It's still, to me, inequality that has a really strong racial component spread over a big space. And so this is the kind of segregation that you don't see in the Marin City Sausalito divide, but you see it in the traffic on the Narrows and Novato, right? You see it in that crazy traffic now. Ever since I came back a few years ago, the worst traffic in the Marin is like getting on the Richmond Center Trail Bridge at 5 o'clock. That's because Marin has one of the lowest rates of people who work in Marin who live in the same county, right? People who work in the county and can afford to live in the same county. It has, I think, the lowest rate, if not, it's definitely top 5 anywhere in the state. We constantly, on all of these metrics, Marin comes out as like the worst, right? And that's really important, right? Like this is the kind of thing. And, you know, and again, it's not entirely, this new form of segregation isn't entirely based on race. It affects me and my generation of white kids who grew up in Marin, who can't even dream of living there. But I, at least, you know, my parents own their way overpriced house that they can't afford to buy, they could never afford to buy. They own it free and clear. I don't got to worry about them. I can maybe even pull some equity out of the house if I need to buy a house. I have that privilege. It's a lot bigger struggle if you grew up in the Canal, if you grew up in Marin City, right? And so when Pastor Marcus Small, right, from the People's Inner City Fellowship in Marin City, talks about his congregants moving, having to move all the way out there as part of the conversation around the waterfront in Sausalito, this is a different kind of segregation than that produced Marin City in the first place. But in my opinion, they're both forms of segregation. And one didn't replace the other. Right? Resegregation isn't like we desegregated and then we resegregated. Resegregation is really maybe like segregation 2.0, but because, you know, I don't want to call it segregation 2.0. It sounds, you know, iPhones get 2.0. Segregation is not an iPhone, right? So I hope that this is clear. And this is, again, a really important thing I think I want to emphasize, that if you're trying to confront this, you're trying to, you know, you have to address this. And so why is this important, right? Again, notice I didn't talk about desegregation, because I think that's kind of been one of our problems, is that we see this as like segregation, desegregation. Well, what we've been doing is going from segregation to like another form of segregation, where the first form of segregation is still there, right? People in the Canal, in Marin City, in North Richmond, and other communities, right, throughout the Bay Area, in West Oakland, in East Palo Alto, are still struggling with the legacy of what happened 70, 80 years ago, at the same time as their kids are now living in Manteca. Both happen simultaneously, right? As Faulkner famously said, you know, the past is not dead, it's not even past, right? More things change, the more they stay the same. But at the same time, you have to understand that things have changed. This is the first paradox of the Marin paradox, is that there's these two kinds. And this is the saddest part, is that when it comes to history of segregation, both the old school one that created Sausalito Marin City and this new school one that sees the children of Marin and Marin City living in Elk Grove, right? These two things happen simultaneously, and Marin has been a really central player in both of these stories. And that, as somebody who grew up in the county and who loves the place and who's got friends and family all over, this is one part that really makes me sad. So what about integration? So one of the things about it is a few people ask about integration, and I don't talk about it very often. And in fact, the thing about it is that everybody who asks about integration largely asks about Marin City. And the challenge is some ways, and one of the reasons why I don't talk about integration is because like Marin City is already hella diverse. Like Marin City is hella integrated, as we say in Northern California, to use the local parlance. Most of the places that we think about as being segregated are actually integrated. Lots of diversity. There's even some amazing places like San Leandro. Like San Leandro was the poster child for segregation. They were on CBS News with Dan Rather in 1970 as like the whitest place. And now it's like 25, 25, 25, 25%, like every language spoken, everything going on, and actually became a really important source of housing for African Americans from East Oakland, who for a long time hadn't been able to move into San Leandro, who were heavily policed every time they walk into San Leandro. Now it's a really important site of African American life, of Asian American life, of Latino life, and of white folks who are doing white folks things in San Leandro. So places do change, and there are these integrated places. But the real question and the real focus needs to be, right, is on the Sausalito side of the border, not on the Marin side, the city side of the border, right? It's these white places that have somehow remained exclusively white or almost exclusively white or majority white for a long time. And again, it's not just Marin County. There are plenty of places around in Northern California that I don't have to mention. But this is one of the key things, right? Don't talk about integration, because integration gets us to these things where we start to target. And that's where the gentrification becomes a problem. If we're focusing on Marin City as the problem or the Canal District as the problem, then we start to like, yeah, maybe they are under resources and they certainly could use more money for schools and libraries and often water systems if you're in the Central Valley and other kinds of things that wealthier communities have. But what they don't need is new people. They don't need to be like, the humans aren't the problem. And that's the problem when we think about things often in these terms, we start to treat those places as the problem. And we have for a really long time. We need to start focusing elsewhere on the communities that have the resources, on the communities like San Anselmo where I grew up. You know, these are the places where I think the focus of the desegregation and again, I don't use the word, it's focus of the fight around segregation and the attempt to make Marin a more equitable place has to happen. And to me, this is really the important, this is the human side of segregation. Gets at people's lived experience, right? And again, it's exciting for me to see whether it's like, you know, Black Lives Matters protests in Fairfax, or the Jolly Roger, my high school newspaper back at high school 1357, did some interesting pieces calling attention to San Anselmo whiteness. You know, we never would have done that back in the day. I'm hella proud of those students for doing that. And I only wish that I'd had the courage back in, you know, 1991 to have done something like that. So this is in some ways the sort of segregation piece, and I want people to understand that. And again, I think this is one of the ways that we can get people to start thinking about this, is to learn a little bit more and kind of confront this. But there's another side of this, which is my urban planner side, which is the systems, right? Because it's not just about racism or even systemic racism, right? It's about how racism is practiced in specific systems, right? You got to take like racism reading, that racism is always, or racism plus policing, right? Racism is practiced it's not just systemically, it's through these very specific systems, right? And that is, again, Marin didn't practice racism entirely just through everything, but through the way it dealt with housing policy or transportation policy or these very specific things. And getting educated about these systems and how they work and how we make changes in these systems. This is one of the things that I think that is really, really critical. Again, it's nice to be anti-racist or try to be anti-racist, but you need to be anti-racist in a particular way. And we can, again, use the knowledges that you have. If you're a professional in a field, be anti-racist in that field. It makes such a huge difference in that being able to be specific. So this is the key thing, and this has been a huge emphasis of my work. Lately, I've got a new book called The Spatial Contract. Very fancy. It's a very fancy title. It's a little bit of an academic book. I'm working on a non-academic version of it. I promise. This is one of the key things that I realized that we're not necessarily learning as much. Again, and we're more likely now to learn, again, unfortunately, mostly about Rosa Parks and Selma and not as much about things that have happened in the Bay Area, but we're more likely to learn about race in those terms, as opposed to learning, again, the history of redlining, the history of how Marin City got built. Every Marin kid is driven past and seen the towers, but knows, I promise, learns nothing in school about the history of public housing, the history of wars and migration. And we need to start learning about these particular systems. And one of the reasons why we do this is I think that we can find inspiration in Marin County in systems in a way that I think can hopefully move us politically towards being able to do more about it. So let's look at some of the systems where Marin has been super successful, right? There's a ton of pride in open space, in the water. We have a world-class water system, but this isn't by accident, right? This is because people organize politically for hours and hours and days and years and decades, right? All the institutions, the water system was built with tons of money from every level of government to make these 7 reservoirs that are phenomenon, right? I'm a Marinite. I'm super proud of MALT and the Marin Agricultural Land Trust and all the work they've done to really kind of pioneer ways of both preserving land and keeping the cheese factory open. Like, this is win-win. Like, we are like, come on. And now look at our cheese industry. It's amazing. It's world-class. I lived in France for years and I'm still happy to come back to Marin County. The California wine I struggle with, but the cheese is like, yay. So this is where we're so proud, but this took so much effort, right? And again, folks on this call might know a little bit about how these organizations came about, right? The crazy plans to put freeways through Sleepy Hollow, which as a San Anselmo resident makes me snicker, the idea of a highway through Sleepy Hollow a little bit, right? But these were crazy ideas. A city of 80,000 people in the headlands, paving over Richardson Bay. I mean, there was all kinds of crazy projects. People organized, they put their political energy, they put their smarts and their education and all of their resource and their money into campaigns to elect people to push back and to make these systems, not just to fight something that was bad, but to make systems we could be proud of, systems people could use to live their lives. And this is the thing that I want, and I think is really kind of critical about Marin County, is what would happen if Marin took those resources and those smarts and that energy and all the stuff that it has used to build open space and the water system and now flood control and MALT and all of these systems and used it to also build housing and to pay attention to transportation. Instead of, again, like with the SMART train, Marin County fought it for so long that by the time we got the train, it's not the train that we need necessarily, right? When we finally got the train, Marin County got the state legislator to pass a specific law only for Marin County to reduce the density around the train stations, not the density up in the hills or the density in West Marin, but the density around the train systems that we had just built. And that's where the area where, again, we really need to be able to sort of focus. What would happen if we took that energy, right? That enthusiasm, that positivity, those resources, and started to put it in to the thornier problem, these equally thorny problems and equally important problems, but the problems that we have done poor on, as opposed to the problems that we have done amazing, kind of, again, world-leading, world-class work to preserve these systems. So earlier in the week, I was listening to a fascinating debate featuring the candidates of the San Anselmo Town Council as part of my effort to learn a little bit more about the politics of my hometown. And it was a very good debate, thanks to the Marin Chamber or San Anselmo Chamber for organizing. It was very interesting. And they addressed a number of issues, from flooding to downtown restaurants, to cycling, to fire readiness. And I was also, I have to admit, like, pleasantly surprised and excited that they talked about San Anselmo's distinct lack of diversity. They talked about affordable housing, and they talked about the politics of renaming San Francis Drake Boulevard. And so just on the surface, it's like, oh, well, great, the candidates are all talking about it. And though there were differences amongst the candidates, and some I sort of thought approached it better than others, or more honestly, or more, in general, like, nobody said anything horribly racist. San Anselmo has one of the only African-American elected officials in all of Marin County, if not the only. Right? So, maybe that's why. But the problem was simply that if you start to dig a little bit deeper, where was the passion? Where was the real knowledge? Where were the real concrete ideas for how to solve things? They weren't as much in the affordable housing space, or they weren't on the diversity question. They were about flood control, right? They were about, downtown, right? Not transportation issues, but the fight over, the business community in the downtown and how to revive the downtown. And it makes sense. And I was so like, their flood knowledge is, you would be surprised that this was a group of, like, I think 2 lawyers, a writer, a teacher, and I forget the other profession of the other council. Nobody is an environmental engineer, but their knowledge of flood control was absolutely tip top. It was super impressive. And guess what? The town of San Anselmo was actually not really in charge. We're part of a sub-regional. Marin County runs flood control. Most of the flood money comes from the state and federal government. They actually have all the engineers behind them talking. But still, clearly they had to communicate to the citizens of San Anselmo that they were experts. And it was impressive. What if they took that same smarts and put it into their responses on housing? And they weren't good. None of them were really able to do that in the same way. I don't think it's necessarily because they aren't smart, but because they know that the people of San Anselmo don't want them to talk too passionately about building more housing, don't want them to talk in a way that sounds like they really know what they're doing and that they're going to end up with more housing. They talked about it in a way as if, okay, we got to check this off the list, but is it going to be our top priority, especially when we got fires and floods and these kinds of issues? And so this is one of the challenges, right? Well, maybe you would say, well, but flooding is a matter of life and death. Well, housing is a matter of life and death too. We've seen with COVID that the dramatic racial inequality in COVID numbers has so much to do with overcrowding and housing conditions, right? With your variability to keep social distance, it's a whole lot easier if you're sitting in a 2,000 square foot house and there's just the 2 of you, right? This is one of our biggest challenges. And that's what I love. I mean, again, I think a lot of the folks on the councils around have the smarts and the ability, and I'm sure we could get together and have flood control debates amongst elected officials in Marin County, and it would be brilliant. I mean, people really know their stuff. And I would just challenge them to embrace housing, embrace transportation, embrace solutions that deal with social equity in the same way. And they almost kind of admitted it in the earlier talk about diversity, that maybe we can we can bring diversity into the town by increasing the number of restaurant jobs downtown or something, so that at least we see diversity on a day-to-day basis. But at no point were they going to figure out how to make it so that Marin's horrible track record of local employment for local workers changes. And this is what, again, this I think is one of the really important things. And I think it's particularly important for individuals, for organizations in Marin County, to push, again, make it so that those elected officials in the next round of debates have to answer those questions with a little bit more passion, with a little bit more knowledge, and can do so with a little less fear. I mean, you can sort of see in people's eyes and people's hearts that they wanted to say more, but they were afraid, because I don't know I have a lot of friends who work in the affordable housing community, and this is part of what I do for a living. I don't know anybody who's worked in Marin County doing affordable housing that doesn't have some form of PTSD. Like, we are notorious for being horrible. And the thing is that everybody, for instance, was talking with pride. I watched a Fairfax debate as well. Everybody's talking with pride about how much they supported the senior housing that was built in Fairfax, but nobody talked about how brutal that process was and how much hell everybody had to go through to build that, or let alone any other affordable housing that's been there. If I say the word Buckeye around a friends of mine, like, people start to, who've been through this, their eyes glaze over. It's just so hard, and we need to make it easier. As Marin County residents, you need to give those elected officials the support, and in some cases the backbone, not all cases, to be able to make those difficult decisions and make it an issue, and learn up. It's great that everybody in the San Anselmo Town Council endorsed ADUs, but I didn't see nearly the sophistication of ADU proposals as I did with flood control. It just sent a message that, yeah, I know that it's important and I'm okay with it, but I'm not going to bring the same energy and passion that I bring to other issues, because it's not that important to me. And so this is, I think, again, really critical. You got to understand the specifics of the systems and get involved in things around housing and transportation and these kinds of things, because thinking about racism or talking about racism alone isn't enough. Racism always happens through things. And again, policing is a system, just like housing, just like transportation, just like libraries, right? Just like education. And we need to talk about it. And again, in those ways, I'm an expert on kind of race in housing or race in land use policy. I'm not an expert in race in policing, and I don't pretend to be, but I know that there are solutions in that space that are very different than the solutions that are in the housing and urban development. So on a final note, and this is, I think I'm gonna try to, I might hit 7:45 right on the button, Abbott. I'm kind of sorry, I'm proud of myself. If you've done public speaking, you know how hard it is. So what are some of the things that folks can do right now? One is there's a moment that's coming where right now the state has given the Bay Area a certain number of houses that it needs to build over the next 7 or 8 years. It's called RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And the Association of Area Governments and MTC, or our regional government, they are going through a process, very participatory process. Marin elected officials are part of it. That's going to put out a number, and it's going to have a number for each county, for the unincorporated areas, and for each town. Marin has historically fought these allocations tooth and nail. Every opportunity to refuse not only the housing, but just even the obligation to build the housing gets refused. This is the first place where I think Marin elected officials, and again, the Marin organizations, can really step up and say, no, we're going to do it differently this year. We're going to set a high target, and we're going to then bring, again, our creativity and our smarts and all of that resources that built MALT, and we're going to turn that into building affordable housing, some of which may actually happen in Point Reyes, because they have a housing crisis too in West Marin, and everybody who lives in West Marin knows it. All right, so this is the first thing. Start paying attention to these things and asking, when you start to see about regional housing, you read J.K. Deneen in the Chronicle, this is one way that you can work specifically. But I think that there's some other ways that we can kind of work in symbolic spaces. And I think one of the things that was most striking about the San Anselmo Town Council meeting was the only consensus that people had, it seemed, around the Sir Francis Drake Boulevard renaming, maybe with one exception of the candidates, is that they kind of hoped that it would just go away as fast as possible so that they could get along with the business of government. And I get it. Renaming Sir Francis Drake Boulevard is not going to house a soul. Nobody's going to get to work faster, easier, more sustainable. It's not going to stop climate change. It's not going to do any of that. And any of the people that have been harmed by racism previously, whether Native communities or Latinx communities or African American communities, isn't going to have anything made whole by getting rid of the name of some English guy that may or may not have ever landed on the coast of Marin, and who's Olima Boulevard was renamed for in the 1930s for some reason I have no idea. But it's an important opportunity, again, to have these conversations and to start to get, I think, a little bit more honesty about our history and a little bit more intent. And the thing is that one of the things about it is that it's about looking to the future. So to be a liberal in the traditional sense means to be future oriented, to be open to change, to even potentially want change. To be conservative is to want to keep things the same. And there's just long been this kind of conservativeness to supposedly liberal Marin that I think is embodied in the controversies over these name changes. And if Marin wants to show that, in fact, no, it actually is liberal. It actually is a progressive place. It actually, stands behind the full totality of the platform of the party that it votes for, then it needs to embrace these opportunities. And I think that this is one of the ways to do so, and embrace the possibility of future, where guess what, it's our future, and we can name things what we want. I think this is a really important part of it. And I know this is difficult. There are elders in my family, who I love deeply, who find the name changes the hardest. And again, they are ardent progressives, ardent Biden supporters, and in every way we agree on everything, but the symbolism of it is really difficult. But I just, and I ask, them, and I ask all of you, especially those of you in older generation who may be attached to these names, to just embrace the possibility that maybe what a conversation in this county about race and changing these names could do. Like, what are the possibilities? I would love to say that I'm a proud alumni of Archie Williams High School. right, on somebody else's boulevard in San Anselmo, California. I think that would be a really wonderful moment. And if you're struggling again with these sort of symbolic politics or the importance of symbolic politics, I would really urge you all, especially if you're an environmentalist, to go to the Sierra Club's website. Can't believe I'm saying this. I've never sent anybody to Sierra Club's website in my life. Or just Google it. You can read a piece called Pulling Down Our Monuments by Michael Brune, who's the National Executive Director of the Sierra Club, where he admits the horrible racist legacy of many of the founders of the club, including John Muir. Right? If you dig into the history of the environmental movement, it is not a wonderful and beautiful place when you get there. The amount of eugenicists, the amount of really kind of horrible racism that was part of that movement. And it's sad in Marin County that some of that definitely permeated into some of the early environmental organizations in Marin County. And I don't think it's necessarily ever really been acknowledged, or we've ever kind of moved on from it. And I think, again, if we want to turn around and solve Marin's housing problem, actually add the housing that we imagine we would build in the 101 corridor. When we said no building in West Marin in 1972, we said yes to building theoretically in the 101 corridor, and we never really did it. If we want to solve these problems, figuring out ways to do ADUs creatively in fire-prone Mill Valley and fire-prone communities in West Marin, right? Throughout the county, we need to be able to kind of move on together and embrace a certain kind of future. And so I think it's really important for people to be able to kind of acknowledge that past to whatever extent without tearing your hair shirt and saying everything we did is awful, right? So this is, I think, a kind of a key opportunity, right? And it doesn't mean that the Sierra Club will stop defending the environment, only that they've now opened up possibilities of working together with communities of color throughout the state of California to build housing and to be part of the solution for the climate crisis, right? Every day that thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands, over 100,000 cars pass over the Altamont Pass, when people are stuck in traffic in the Richmond Center Trail Bridge, that creates tailpipe emissions, which are the #1 cause of greenhouse gas emissions. If you care about climate change, you have to care about affordable housing. And so this is the thing. I think there's an opportunity for every organization in Marin, not just the sort of political organizations, but social groups, environmental organizations, to really take a step back and take a look at what's done in the past and try to figure out how they're going to become part of the solution of housing people, of moving people around, and of making Marin County the kind of equitable and progressive place that I think it really truly does want to be and imagine itself as, and I think really can be. And I think this would go a whole long way to addressing the same issues for the region and for the state of California, because you could extrapolate up in all of California in some ways, in a lot of ways, epitomizes some of the challenges I think that we have in Marin County. 3 minutes late. I hope this was helpful. I'm sorry, I am from Marin, but I spoke like a New Yorker. It was necessary to get it all in. But thank you.
Thank you, Alex. You've given us a lot to think about. You know, I'm glad we're recording this because I think many of us, including myself, will want to kind of get another chance to consider a lot of these ideas that you're introducing. So we'll move on to the Q&A period now. There is a chat bubble that should be down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can, as a participant, send me a private message with a question that I can ask Alex. I have some questions that I've already assembled that came in through the RSVP later than the questions that Alex presented as part of his talk, and a few of my own. So Alex, do you mind if I just start?
Fire away.
Okay. Well, we'll start with one that's kind of builds off of what you were just talking about with environmentalism, but what does a pro-housing environmentalism look like to you?
That's a really excellent question. This is so again, I mean, number one is if you're an environmentalist that cares about climate crisis, you know, people driving hours and hours every day in their cars to get to and from jobs in Marin County is such a huge danger, and that just has to become a priority, right? To be a good environmentalist. And again, a lot of statewide organizations have really embraced this. Climate Plan is a relatively new organization led by Chanel Fletcher, who's brilliant. Planning and Conservation League, which is an old school organization, has really kind of transformed itself. Again, the Sierra Club is starting to take steps, the Nature Conservative is starting to take steps. So I'd really love to see local organizations in Marin County starting to learn a little bit more from the statewide efforts and really sort of start to channel that emphasis on finding solutions for housing, for transportation. When it comes to the local environment, right, again, preserving watersheds, preserving creeks, you know, there's no need to be able to sort of pave over existing things. Even in the case of Sausalito, right? We have a waterfront issue. There are all kinds of reasons to not build housing in a certain place. So one of the things, as an environmentalist, I think you need to imagine, the goal isn't just housing everywhere, which it totally used to be in 1955. There's no question that that was like, you know, bulldoze anything and everything, but that's not the world that we live in. And we recognize that there's hard choices, but people need to stop talking about the fact that we are built out. It's just simply not true. Many of the communities in the city centers have aging buildings that can be, you know, either knocked down or reconstructed. Yes, there are ADU solutions, but there are also possibilities for duplexes and triplexes. There are even plenty of places where there are larger structures that can be turned that could also contribute to environmental amenities. If you care about environmentalism in terms of like restoration, about environmental justice, about other aspects of environmentalism, housing development projects can be incredible contributors to restoring environments because they provide the capital and the need, and then ultimately the users of some of that open space. So there's just kind of all kinds of ways, let alone green building. There are fire issues. We could keep going. But again, the organizations I mentioned can be really great sources of learning how you and your environmental beliefs can become more in line with pro-housing. And you need to keep pushing them, and we all do as well.
Okay, another question. Do you think the state should step in and force Marin to build more housing?
That's a very good question. Yes and no. So like, that's not the way it works, right? I mean, like the state is a legislator that is run by elected officials from everywhere. So it's like, it's not the Sacramento is going to come force it. It's just the elected peoples are going to vote. And it's like, if the majority of people are like, hey, Marin, we need your help to build housing, you're not building enough housing. You know, that 46,000 people, when we added 2.5 million people, like that's not cutting it. You're right in the center of the Bay. Like, we need your help. So this isn't like some government in Sacramento saying it. It's like elected officials from everywhere that are saying it. What Marin needs is to make sure that its elected officials in Sacramento are actually saying, yeah, we're in. That's what we need. Like, we're in, and we're going to figure out how to do this right. Like, we can do it. Like, we built Malt. We built all these open space. We're really smart. We've got resources. We're awesome. We're Marin. We're on top of it. And, you know, let us come up with a plan. So that's what you know, again, it's like, yeah, the way this politics are going, this, like, the rest of the state of California isn't having it anymore. And they're going to start saying, like, forcing us as fellow Californians. It's not the state doing it. It's other Californians saying to Marin. And that's going to happen. And I'd just rather see Marin County get on the front foot and be like, we're going to be innovators here, and we're going to change our own zoning, and we're going to raise money locally to finance things locally, because you can do that. And we have lots of money, right? So not always cash money, but we've got equity in houses. When equity in houses can be put into equity in other houses. And we can find really innovative ways of ramping up ADU production. So Marin sets a goal of being the fastest growing ADU market in the state, but it's not doing that. I mean, Sonoma and Napa are really innovating in ADUs, San Mateo County innovating in ADUs, Santa Cruz County innovating in ADUs. You don't get the same push. And again, I have friends who work in local government in Marin County. They do everything that they can, but they don't have the support from their electeds who do everything that they can, but they don't have the support from the populace. So as a Marin County voter, folks need to provide the possibility to do that. So I hope that makes sense.
Sure. And do you think that, you know, as far as an allocation of more housing or affordable housing, that it's best applied at the level of the individual municipality, as far as like having new housing and affordable housing built in Sausalito rather than, say, as part of some larger county quota or something like that?
I mean, I, the RENA process is a kind of, we could talk for hours about the good, the bad, and the ugly of this regional housing needs assessment. At this point, it's just allocated to governments that have land use power. So if you have power over land use, then you get an allocation and you have to do something about it. That's what it's saying. And so as long as like that everybody has that, like as long as Sausalito wants to keep its land use power, then it's going to have to deal with the housing. If it doesn't want its land use power, it can happily give it to Marin County, and Marin County will just allocate the housing.
And you mean
So that's the key. And again, people want local control. Well, like I like to think of it as citizenship, right? Citizenship isn't just like all these awesome things you receive from like being a citizen of a place. It's also a set of obligations to vote, to participate, to pay taxes. This is a form of citizenship. Like we have obligations as humans, as citizens of this state to contribute in every way. And I don't have a problem with that. And I think so yeah, I mean, if you're asking me, what I like to see, again, I'm not running for office, so I guess I can say controversial things, but yeah, I mean, not all of our cities and towns are equally capable. Does it make sense to have these same boundaries? I think one of the most awesome things that Marin did, speaking of innovation and policing, is when it combined the Twin Cities Police Department and San Anselmo Police Department to create the Central Marin Police Department. Not because I believe in, but because they consolidated two agencies to save a lot of people a lot of money and to make the system theoretically better, right? So we can embrace, there are times where, again, I don't know if these cities can do it on their own. So why not form joint, there are a lot of ways that cities can band together. We could have a Ross Valley housing initiative where the cities combine. And Ross will probably pay a lot of money to not have housing, but that's what happens.
Okay. And when you say land use, you mean like zoning?
Yeah, basically zoning, right? The rules, like what can get built where. That's the main power that local jurisdictions have. They got lots of responsibilities to like get you all kinds of services, but they don't got a lot of power. The one thing they got a lot of power on is like, yeah, you can build it, or no, you can't.
Okay, here's another question. With COVID-19, we've seen a massive shift among white-collar employees towards working remotely. Yeah. How do you see that trend figuring into the overall dynamic of racial segregation in the Bay Area?
Well, it would take me too long probably to explain the Bay Area. So why don't I start with Marin? Marin is going to make the situation a lot more difficult, right? Because you've seen the way home prices have gone in Marin since the pandemic happened. There were a lot of very wealthy Silicon Valley folks who the only reason they weren't living in Marin is because you couldn't commute easily down to the Silicon Valley, and now you can. Now you don't need to. So I think the home prices, single family home prices, Marin is at risk of becoming even more and more exclusive. And this is a very, very, very challenging experience for us, because it's not going to come necessarily, again, if there are a lot of home sales, then at least it will generate new property tax revenue for the locals. And so hopefully it will create at least some excess funds for local governments to perhaps be able to channel that money into affordable housing options. But that's good. The primary pressure on Marin County is going to be just more insanity of what was before. Again, the impacts in different parts of the Bay is a longer conversation.
Okay. Redlining and racial covenants during the 20th century prevented people of color in Marin from participating in the massive accrual of generational wealth bestowed upon white homeowners by rising home values. What is your opinion of reparations to address that economic crime?
So I think it's a really important conversation to have. How to do it, I am in theory in favor of some form of reparation. Again, how to do it. I particularly like that the writer talked about it in terms of I think that actually practically, in some ways, like access to land needs to be a really important part of whatever reparations that happen. Cash is not king anymore. You could have a suitcase full of cash and it's not going to get you housing in Marin County, California. And I think that that's going to be one of the things that can be, I think, one of the ways that, again, if governments are thinking about it in terms of reparations, and again, it's a very long and difficult conversation. It's the spirit, right? Again, and the thing is I'm not just talking about, reparations for slavery, but also reparations for, get all manners of inequality that were done to Native peoples all the way on up, and that are continuing to happen. In my book, I talk a little bit about restorative justice, which is a concept that comes from, the criminal justice system, which is about victims and the perpetrators. But we need to start thinking about a restorative justice in a land use, in a housing, in land use, in these decisions, all the ways in which communities were not just prevented from living in housing, but the ways that communities were polluted. Environmental injustice is a horrendous problem in communities of color still throughout the United States. And so I think this is a really critical point that they raise is, I can't get on this here, I can't explain how to do it necessarily. I don't even think I know how to do it, but I do know that it needs to connect to land and to housing, or else it won't actually be worth as much.
Okay, another question. You highlighted Marin creativity to find solutions for malt and open space, but those innovations benefit the views and lifestyles of wealthy folks. Do you think wealthy Marin residents will prioritize this if it affects their views and doesn't directly benefit them?
I'm glad, thank you for asking the really difficult question, in which the answer is, I don't know. I hope so. I'm committed to trying to convince them to do so. I'm committed to trying to raise my voice or help other people raise their voice so that they do so. Yeah, when I said earlier, again, I apologize to communities of color on this call that feel like I'm speaking to powerful white folks. In some ways, that's part of the reason is that, yeah, it's going to require not all of these people, but a certain critical mass of people who have power and influence and resources in Marin County to willfully say, actually, we're going to pivot here. We're going to make a change. We're going to do things a bit differently. And we're going to find ways to doing it. And the thing is again, if it's all about beauty, there's so many beautiful things that you can make in making housing and making communities and making spaces. There's so many amazing things that can be done. And that I think need to be done in this way. And so again, if that's what you want, is it to be pretty or to be beautiful? Or even if all you want is to have stuff that you can use, again, it can be done with parks and open space and new restaurants and all kinds of new vitality and new life that you can use. If it needs to be about you, we can make it about you. But I hope that there are enough folks out there who want to make it not about them and make it about the communities that are going to be built in this space and that are going to live and raise families and be part of the Marin of the future.
Okay, one more question, and then we'll let you go and maybe leave us with any final thoughts. How did your time in the UK and France affect your perspective on segregation and desegregation and affordable housing in the United States or in the Bay Area?
That's a great question. So as a scholar, of somebody who's concerned about and studies racism, it helped me understand that racism is everywhere, and it's been part of the foundation of so many societies. I was living in the two biggest colonial empires in the world. Well, apologies to the Spanish and the Portuguese, but two of the biggest colonial empires in the world, and to see the way that they are trying to confronting it, it was a really eye-opening experience for me, and it really kind of helped me gain that kind of perspective. And I think that was really particularly powerful, and I really recommend, for anybody who's trying to understand, to kind of see that in other places. It also taught me about what it's like to live in countries that have like functional systems for building housing and transportation. I mean, the French are just simply better at those things than we are. And it's not because look, we almost have caught up in cheese. Like, we can catch up when it comes to housing. It just, inclusionary zoning is a hot button issue. Everything is fought over everything. It's a 20% inclusionary requirement throughout the entire nation of France. And so, and it gets built because they can build large projects, and because people, when people see development in France, they don't see the enemy, right? And then one of the challenges in the US is that if you're a low income person and you see development, you assume it's not for you and it's probably going to displace you. If you're an upper income person, you're like, no development, I don't like it, it blocks my view. And so nothing gets built. And in France, it's just not like that, right? People just understand that, like, new developments need to happen, new cities get built, new towns, whole new pieces of infrastructure, and they just have a different politics. Same when it comes to transportation. Uh, and again, some of us, they don't let social politics, like, they may not agree on gay marriage actually, but that doesn't stop them from funding the bus system. And that's what happens in the United States too, is that some of our kind of big social divisions just are now, and you're seeing it sort of undermine our very ability to do absolutely everything. And that's why things are starting to fall apart. And that's one of the things that just doesn't seem to happen in Europe as well. And there's just so much to learn. It's embracing a politics of something that's more possible. And I'm glad that please thank you whoever asked this question, because I think one of the hardest things to do, which is terrifying, is to get Californians to be able to like look to other parts of the world, not just Europe, but Asia, Latin America, Africa, places everywhere. There is, like, when it comes to urban development and housing, doing things that are oftentimes better or more innovative than we are. Be open to sort of things happening elsewhere as possibilities. One of the saddest things about the town council is, like, one of the council candidates was mentioning about how he was inspired by cycling in Amsterdam and was kind of ridiculed by another candidate as being like, we're not bringing those Amsterdam-y ideas here. And like, that's really sad that, that again, the idea that something comes from somewhere else is somehow a threat. And I hope we embrace, again, we're supposed to be better than that. We're supposed to be smarter than that. And I think that that's particularly critical. I guess as a last note, I first just want to thank the Marin City Library and the Sausalito Public Library for hosting me, and for the folks that have made the time on this call to listen, or who are listening to this not live, but if watching the videotape and are now hearing me wrap up. I appreciate it. Again, if I can be of assistance, reach out to me, and within whatever is possible, I will try, especially if you're interested in trying to improve learning opportunities, or if you're engaged in one of these processes around race and housing in your community, and you would like some sort, and I can be of any assistance. But I think one of the last thing that I want to leave is just maybe a question of responsibility. And again, I read over those questions about how do I convince people who are, think we're not racist or anti-racist. And this is one of the things I really don't understand, is sort of how, I'm born in 1974, which is after a lot of the things that we're talking about were done. I've lived outside of Marin County for most of my adult life, and I still largely do. I only spent sort of part of the time in Marin with my folks, but I largely live elsewhere. I still accept responsibility for what Marin is and what it's become, and I accept responsibility, and I love to be involved in helping Marin become something different. And admitting the sins of the past and sort of coming to terms with this, like, doesn't mean, again, that we didn't do any other things that were good. It doesn't mean that everybody is a horrible person and bad. It just means, like, no, we could have done better. We should have done better. And I, as an individual, as a citizen, accept responsibility for the situation that we're in, and I'm committed to helping to try to change that. And I hope other folks, again, folks who are really just still resistant and accepting that level of, like, yeah, we were part of it, or I'm part of that. I hope you can overcome that and channel that into positive action. I don't sit around crying and tearing my shirt apart. I just, I write things, I do research, I try to do things that are useful in this space. Again, just like you do in other parts of the world, again, in the environmental space, in economic matters, in so many other things. And just all I'm saying is take responsibility for the racial injustice that is part of Marin County, and see if you can be part of coming to terms with some sort of solution.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Alex, and for all
My
the
pleasure.
time you've given us. And we wish you well in all your future endeavors. And I thank everyone who has participated or sent questions, participated in this program, and all of you who attended and listened with us through to the end. Thanks very much. Keep an eye out for future Sausalito Library programs, and we'll say good night.
Yeah.